Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. So if I can share just to make sure everyone's grounded onto where we are. When we talk about, last week we talked about the iceberg, see the iceberg, brace the iceberg. And the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is the injuries and death that occur from police actions, interactions with different communities. And you may remember the slide from last week. It has 4 ethnic groups. It has white in the upper left, white non-Hispanic. It has blacks in the upper right. It has white, Hispanic, lower left, and Native American. And these are all displaying per capita counts of hospitalizations and fatalities per 10,000 police interactions. So, and you can see they're all pretty similar. They all have about 1.5 hospitalizations per 10,000 interactions with the police, regardless of race. Again, Native Americans are a little bit lower, but the research this is pulled from said that may have been from reporting of the uniform crime report, that this the FBI report that generates this. There may not have been data, so those are a little lower. But you can see here, white, blacks, Hispanics all have about the same hospitalization rate. Their fatality rate is all pretty similar as an amount of police interactions, 1 per 10,000 police interactions. But the iceberg, so this is the tip of the iceberg. When George Floyd gets murdered, he's down here in this fatal encounter with the police. But what's fueling that tip of the iceberg, this is where we went last year when we talked about the systemic funnel. Now we're looking at, again, broken out by ethnicity. And this is looking at arrests per 10,000 of that ethnic population and stops per 10,000. So, upper left, 355 whites per 10,000 get arrested by the police. So this is what's funneling that interaction rate is the arrests and stops. 148 stops per 10,000. But look at, again, the black population almost over triple just about arrests per 10,000 population, over almost twice as many stops per 10,000. And, you look at Hispanics, again, it's disparate. Native Americans, it's disparate. So this is where we were last week. That was the iceberg, right? The disparate amount of the funnel that funnels more police interactions in per 10,000, which then results in having more interactions of which that relatively constant rate of hospitalization or fatality. But a lot of questions came up. What's driving that? What is causing arrests and stops? There's all of the common arguments. Is it criminality? Is it racial disparity and who's making phone calls to the police, and that's causing more interactions? So today, to go deeper along the iceberg, I'm going to try and dive into that a little bit and break that apart. The first thing, one of the first questions we got is this arrests and stops because of 911 calls? I've seen a lot of speculation. Well, maybe there's more blacks committing crime and getting 911 called them, or some people are saying, look, whites are racist, that happens. Maybe they're calling the police unfairly on blacks more often, and that's leading to higher interactions, the 911 calls. Well, we need to break policing down into 2 kinds of policing. There's reactive policing, which is the response. That's the response to a 911 call. And then there's something called proactive policing, which is not answering a specific 911 or dispatch call. And we're going to start with the reactive policing, because I think this is where people gravitated. And the data here, we have, it's very hard to tell, for example, the question of, well, are white people just calling the police more on black? We know about incidents. We see it on Twitter. We see it on YouTube, videos. But it's hard to tell systemically. And does that result in this? Well, one of the challenges of getting this data is most times 911 calls aren't taking the race of the caller. So it's unusual to find good data that lets us know, like, hey, whites disproportionately call on blacks, and that's unfair because it's targeting the police on them. But we do have research, and this is just recent as of earlier this year, that came out. And there's a link. Again, all the links in this are below in the things. There were 2 million 911 calls that they're able to study in 2 cities. And what they looked at was, and these cities, these 911 calls were dispatched to 4 different kinds of city. One was predominantly black, over 80% population black. One was predominantly white, over 80% white. One was predominantly Hispanic, over 80% Hispanic, and one was mixed. 2 million records across all 4 cities that this one common police department was being dispatched to. Well, first of all, they found out that white officers used force 60% more than black officers on average. This is across all calls. And they found that was significant to note that there was a systemic disparity in the propensity to use force just by the race of the police officer themselves. And they suggest that there may be a difference in who is attracted to the police force between whites and blacks. But the important thing for that question of sort of reactive policing, what's driving this iceberg, they were able to look at what was the use of force relative between the race of the officer who responded and the predominant race of the city from which the call emerged. Remember, we can't track every individual call by race, but we know what 911 calls emerged from a predominantly black city, and we can kind of take as a proxy that it's, those are probably black callers. Likewise, if it's a white city, we can kind of, it's a rough proxy, it's not perfect. But what was interesting is that white and black officers used force at the same rate when dispatched to a predominantly white city. But when white officers were dispatched to a predominantly black city, they used gun force 5 times more often. And this is true even in Hispanic cities. When white officers were dispatched to Hispanic cities, they also used force more disparately. But what they found is when black and Hispanic officers were dispatched to white cities, they didn't use force disproportionately, and no one used force disproportionately when it was a mixed city. So it was pretty clear from this reactive policing standpoint that when the interaction of officer of a certain race is dispatched, and in this case whites, is dispatched to a predominantly black or Hispanic city, they're more likely to use force. Now, this isn't true of the entire US. These were 2 million records over 4 cities in a certain area, so we can't draw more than that, but that's a pretty big data set. And again, white officers were more likely to use force when dispatched to a predominantly black or Hispanic. No one was likely to use more force when they went to a white city or a mixed city. So I think there's something to say about this reactive policing, that it's not necessarily whites are calling police on more blacks, but when whites are dispatched to black or Hispanic areas, they're more likely to use force. Getting into proactive policing, this is where I really wanted to dive into the iceberg, right? The generation, because reactive policing, you can say, well, it's an emergency, it's a dispatch. Proactive policing is not based off a 911 call. And it's really important. Now, I'm going to do a case study of Ferguson here, because this is where the Department of Justice report really sheds some light on the iceberg. A lot of the proactive policing is actually not even safety or what I would call law and order related. It's fine generation. It's about collecting fines and fees. And this was really true in Ferguson. So Ferguson, Missouri has a municipal court that's under the oversight of the county clerk. But importantly for this thing, remember that the county clerk, not the judge, but the clerk, is an employee of the Ferguson Police Department. So this municipal court with oversight of Ferguson, again, Ferguson only has 20,000 people in it. The code of Ferguson reads like the homeowners agreement from hell, the HOA covenant from hell. They have literally regulated every aspect of living in this city. Housing violations, you need permits to rent, you need removal of trash service, animal control, barking dog running at large, walking. They have a way and manner of walking. Are you walking in a roadway? The manner in which you're walking road, everything is regulated, and these are not safety related violations, or what I would call municipal code violations. And when these citations, the citations that are generated from this are not exactly clear as to what they're describing or if you need to attend court. So say, for example, your trash was out, you could be issued a citation by the Ferguson Municipal Court as a fine to say this, and you wouldn't know necessarily what date that trash was out or if you needed to go to court. Now, the trick with Ferguson is that most cities, when they issue a fine, you go down and you pay the fine. You don't need to go to court if you're just going to pay the fine. But in Ferguson, of 376 municipal offenses, almost 230 required a court appearance. So you couldn't just go pay the fine. You also had to go to the court. And things that required a court appearance were dog creating a nuisance, equipment violations, no passing zones, right? Overgrown vegetation. If you had overgrown vegetation, you had to go to court. You couldn't just pay the fine. It's a failure to remove leaves. The courts themselves were, and we'll get into a little bit more of why this is, they were very much run like machines. There's testimony in there that if you didn't have a lawyer, and you tried to argue your case, there was a tendency in the town to arrest you for contempt and hold you in jail for up to 10 days. So like defendants who would try and go and you have your day in court, you want to contest this fine of your trash, you could be arrested, in contempt of court. Even folks who had lawyers, the lawyers testified to the Department of Justice that there were frequent interruptions of the defense they tried to have by the court, and when they objected to the interruptions of the case they were making, the court threatened to arrest the lawyers and put them in jail. And this is where it really builds the iceberg, is these these are not these are not safety violations, these are sort of code violations. But the key is the court can assess a fine of up to $1,000 for any violation. And if you fail to appear in the court, that's another fine on top of the first one. And it's important to talk about, how much is going on in this court. So this is a fine scheme. So let me show this picture here of what this looked like. Right, this is the leading up. So by way of clearing the chart, municipal violations and fine collection 2009 to 2014, Ferguson, source of the Department of Justice. On the left, you have the number of violations that were issued by this court. On the right, you have the fines and fees that were either budgeted or collected. And what the chart shows is it shows from 2009, it showed the number of traffic violations and the number of non-traffic violations. Now, traffic violations, some of these may be safety related, but like 98, 99% of them were non-safety related. Oh, and by the way, you have the population of the city here held, and you can see the population is constant. It's not adjusting much over the years. But what happened is there was this dramatic increase in the number of violations, and what's driving that is here, you see this blue line here? This is the targeted budget for the city of Ferguson to say, we anticipate we're going to get this much money from fines. And you can see in 2010, it's a little bit less than 1.5 million, same in 2011, and then it jumps. In 2012, the target raises up quite significantly, and they actually beat the target. They increased the revenue target by 30%, and then brought in more in this. This red line is the actual revenue they earned. And that began this feedback cycle where every year they would set the new budget target at the amount they collected from the past year. So you can kind of see here in 2012, fiscal year 2012, that becomes the target in 2013, and the actual collected is more. So what's collected in 2013 becomes the target in 2014, and then that's exceeded. And keep in mind, the protest from Michael Ferguson's death occurred in August of 2014. So this is the context of what's driving this iceberg, this massive proliferation of municipal violations, mainly for fines and revenue, leading up to the death of Michael Brown. First of all of these violations that were issued, the Department of Justice could only find one case that required jail time for the violation itself. So if you think like there's a violation for firearms, you may say, okay, that needs jail time. Safety violations tend to have jail time associated with it. Overwhelmingly, like as I said, only one of the violations they found had jail time up front. Overwhelmingly, these violations themselves carry no jail time for the underlying offense. They're, failure to collect leaves, manner of walking in a street. These don't carry jail time in the violation. However, in the Municipal Code of Ferguson, if you fail to appear to the court or you fail to pay any, either the fine or any installment of a fine, then you are subject to arrest, even if the violation itself, the underlying violation, isn't arrestable. So this is what drives the funnel, and this is where we start looking now at what's driving this, right? This is whites, non-Hispanics in Ferguson. And again, these are normalized. So this is now Ferguson. We were looking at the iceberg in Ferguson, and or nationally, now we're looking at the iceberg in Ferguson. Municipal violations per 10,000. There were 8,700 municipal violations, which led to 8,700 charges per 10,000. And again, as I said last week, there's only about 6,000 or 7,000 whites in Ferguson. So I don't want people to say, well, there's not 10,000 whites, the chart's wrong. It's a normalized per capita, so we can make meaningful comparisons to another population. But this is not good for whites either, obviously. It's like 8,700 municipal violations, drives to the charges, drives to the vehicle stops, drives to the vehicle searches and arrested per 100,000, right? So this is the black, this is the iceberg, right? This is the black experience. So it was 8,700 for whites. For blacks per 10,000, the municipal violations are 33,000, right? That's what drives this. Again, these are not safety and law and order. This is, you get a violation for not picking up your trash. You don't know to appear in the court because it doesn't say so on the citation. You miss the court date. They add a failure to appear violation on top of it. That has an arrest warrant that can be issued, plus an additional fine. And this is what's driving that funnel, right? This municipal code violation that's not violence related or crime related. And remember, the criminal rate stayed constant throughout the period in question, 2009 to 2014. Violent crime stayed constant. So that growth in violations was not driven by a need for addressing crime. It was driven by a need to collect more revenues and fees, which was evidenced by the fact that they take the amount they got last year and make that target for the next year. And what this results in is a disparity between black and white interactions in Ferguson with the court and the police. You know, if you look at compared the white experience and the black experience for municipal violations per 10,000, blacks are 4 times more likely to have 1 or more municipal violations than whites. 2.5 times more likely to get charged, 2.5 more times likely to be vehicle stopped, nearly 5 times more likely to have their vehicles searched. And the arrested as a result per 10,000 is about 6 times more likely, because what happens is as the court begins issuing these arrest warrants, not for failure to pick up leads, but for failure to appear in court, failure to pay your fine on time, the police would constantly stop people in the city. And this is documented in the report that they would target those who looked ignorant and conduct a stop to see if they had warrants. Now, constitutionally, that's illegal. You can't stop someone without reasonable suspicion that they have either violated a crime or a statute that they're doing so now, or that they are in the process of doing one. You can't just stop people and check them for warrants, but that was what Ferguson was doing, and they were arresting anyone they found. So and these are not all black men. These are 67-year-old black women. These are people who didn't know they even had a citation against them that drove this. And so this is really, I think, speaks to a lot of why are the police, this disparate policing begins much earlier in the, and I'm not saying the police are free from blame in this. Remember, the police, the county clerk in the courthouse is a police department employee, but the municipality itself had a scheme or organization to basically generate revenue. And it's very clear because they have the emails, they have the conversations. This was about revenue. And what they did is they basically increased enforcement of municipal violations for anything. You hear the phrase walking while black, running while black, driving while black. Literally in Ferguson, it was living while black. There was no way you could escape 396 different violations you could be tagged of 230 of which require a court appearance. What they did then is when people didn't appear for court because they didn't know or they missed a payment, that's when they used the police. The police were used as a fine collection dragnet. And they would basically use this because once you're arrested, now you really have to pay, and they would do bonds. And there's a whole bunch more. But if the arresting itself was disparate, the police officer always has the discretion of whether to arrest on a warrant. And they found that, and I'm going off the top of my head here, but like I think it was something like 96% of arrests made off officer discretion were black. You know, they weren't, you know, and you saw the whites had their, you know, it wasn't that this was easy living for the whites in the town either. Their municipal violations and things like that as well were high. But it was clearly disparately policed against the black population. And this drives that iceberg. Now, one of the questions that came over the week is a lot of people were like, well, why don't they just vote them out? Why do the people tolerate this intolerable injustice if it's a municipal city? And let me pull up real quick here. Thought I had this already skewed. There we go. You know, why do they tolerate this and why don't they just vote them out? So we have the data from the elections that show why this is not as easy as it may seem, right? So this looks at turnout in Ferguson, municipal elections, and it's comparing national elections and municipal elections. And what's important to understand is that probably 80 to 100 years ago, there was a big progressive movement in the country to separate municipal election days from national election days. The theory at the time is you don't want the passions of a national presidential election to muck with good local, voting. You want to have, so the actual municipal elections are held off cycle from the national elections, and I think it's like April for Ferguson. Well, you can see here how this influences a population that is majority black. The turnout rates are very, very different. Now, obviously, turnouts that are not on national election days are going to be lower in general, but you see here, the November election, the 2012 November election, presidential election, 54% turnout from African Americans, 55% whites, fairly close. You could probably account for some. And again, this isn't looking into well-discussed voter suppression tactics and all that, like polling stations. This is looking at when the election itself is scheduled. But look at the municipality elections. 17% whites and 6% African Americans. Both are down a lot, but the white representation is almost twice. And this is why, for a city that was majority black, there were no black city councilors. There was no black representation in the municipal offices while this is going on. And this really, when you talk about the racial composition of votes, it really shows the difference. When you look at everyone who voted in the 2012 election, 71% were African American, 28% were whites. But when it comes to municipal, it's flipped. And all of a sudden, a city that's a majority of a community of color becomes, in effect, a majority of a minority, which in this case were the whites, and they're voting for these policies. So, and there's a whole host more of this. If you have a felony in Missouri, you can't vote. Well, if you didn't pick up your trash or didn't do your leaves, that's not a felony. But if your fines get above a certain level, or you fail to appear in court in a certain number of times, they can add a felony to it, kind of like they're adding on these charges. And of all these violations, probably 1 out of every 3 was a failure to appear violation. So they were using these violations to effectively systemically make sure that a lot of the population were considered felons and couldn't vote. And that is, I mean, this is, I think, gets to a lot of the questions of the deeper iceberg. So I want to pause here, see what questions we have. It's good to see. Thanks for joining, Silja, Joshua, Chris, Ed, Courtney, Michael, Christine, Shama, Lisa, James. Yeah, cities need to stop using their cops as backdoor tax collectors. Good. I mean, that's the point, John. Now this is Ferguson. This is a case study. I can't say every police department is like this. I don't have that data. But when they did the Baltimore investigation, the Department of Justice did the Baltimore investigation after the black died in the back of the police van, that they found similar things. You will find these patterns. I wouldn't be surprised if the Seattle Police Department had a similar pattern. So you need to look at these patterns and see this is the bottom of the iceberg. This is the grievance. You imagine living in this town. So let's take a step back. We've done charts and numbers, right? But the municipal court that's running this machine is only open 3 days a month for about 3 hours a time. And they are running through thousands of cases and charges during that short period of time. I think I had it, it's something like 15 to 2,000 offenses are being run in a single 3-hour session, and there's only 3 to 4 times a month. So it's kind of like, the highest that they actually added additional clerks to basically process this crush. But I figured it out. It's about, if you were in Ferguson and got one of these violations, you were charged with your trash being out or walking in a certain manner in the roadway. You had on average about 33 seconds for your case to be considered in these treadmills of cases. And think about the last time you went through TSA and what a joy that was. All you're doing there is taking your shoes off, your laptop out of your backpack, any liquids get rid of. You're doing a set of interactions, and there's people moving through it, hundreds. You probably had more time at a TSA checkpoint to take your shoes off, get your laptop out of your backpack, make sure your cell phone was out and all that. Then these people had to present their defense against these municipal fine violations. And even when they presented defenses, as I said up front, they were being intimidated by the court that would threaten them with contempt and jail time. And even lawyers that would try to defend would threaten with contempt and jail time. So Heather's asking, was there a previous loss of city revenue, or is this just greed? It's pretty clear from the email that they are reacting in part. It's a chicken and the egg, right? They are reacting to municipal shortfalls in revenue, one of which I would argue is because no business wants to locate themselves where you systemically oppress a population and no one has any money because they're paying court fees. But putting that aside, they're reacting to loss of municipal revenue. But the way they're choosing to react to it is to simply turn the crank on this revenue collection. There are emails, and this is in the Department of Justice report, you can go through it. There are emails where they say, hey, we're down by 11%. Chief of police, what's your idea? The chief of police says, give me 2 more officers. I'll adjust to 12-hour shifts. We'll get out there and we'll get more violations that will generate more revenue and we'll be able to close the gap. They reach an agreement, problem solved. Obviously, not problem solved. So this is this is not the bottom of the iceberg. I may do, like, there's a lot more to this iceberg, but this is well underneath the surface of the iceberg. And I think it puts to question these common reactions of, well, it's just because blacks are more criminal and more violent. These violations have nothing to do with criminality or violence. They're fee collection, but it's driving the police interaction that we saw was already disparate. So there's another snapshot here, which we find, and this was sent by muleteer Michael Groover. Is it Michael Groover or Mike Groover? Sent me this, and it's a pretty blatant, obvious. You know, there was these federal sentencing laws. Here we go. Federal sentencing laws are a great snapshot into the iceberg, right? They're part of the iceberg because they give a snapshot into racial disparity. And what happened in 2010 is there was a law on the drug war. Everyone knows the drug war is disparate. But part of the law, and this has been going on for decades, but part of the law in 2010 is the minimum amount of cocaine you had to have on you changed. And that change dropped the level of minimum amount of cocaine you had on it to get a more severe sentence. And what happened when that occurred is, well, I just got to show it. It's got to be seen to believe. Now, this chart comes from The Economist. So on the left here, just to clear the chart, we have black and Hispanics on the top. We have whites on the bottom. These are grams of crack. And this is from 1999 to 2010. So we're talking 20 years here. This is a distribution of the drug amount cited in convictions for possessions following natural looking distribution. So, I mean, you think about it, the highest, and these are frequency, and this is grams of crack. So it's a common tale, right? It's a distribution that shows you had the most people had the least amount of crack, and then it had a natural distribution that as you had more crack, you know, not everyone out there is being the Walter White of crack. You get fewer and fewer of those cases, and it sort of shows what's a normal tail distribution. But from 2011 to 2015, on the right side of this chart, this is when the new law was passed that if you had the minimum sentences doubled at 280 grams. And look at what happens. I mean, if I didn't know any better, this chart looks so wrong, I'd think it was made in Georgia, right? All of a sudden, you have this nice distribution tail, and then it pops up conveniently right at the spot where the minimum sentence is double if you are found with this. And it's a really obvious outlier that just begs disbelief. It's valid data. I mean, it happens down here again for whites. It's not that whites are immune, but blacks clearly got a disproportionate targeting of this. And this is not Georgia data. This is legitimate data. It just is, it begs disbelief that this would just be coincidental when all of these other ones follow distribution. But yet conveniently, the one area that pops up at way outside the norm happens to be the area where a threshold effect is gained for doubling the minimum sentence. So that's a sort of an example of a snap, and that's just a snapshot. It's hard to find snapshots like this where you can see the iceberg crystallize in an instant, but that was a pretty good one because you had this change in the law from 20 years to new thing, and you saw all of a sudden the distribution modify. So let me pause here. If you haven't yet, if you like this information or you like what we do on other parts, please consider joining our Patreon. All our muleteers subscribers, it's only $5 a month. www.patreon.com/infomullet. We appreciate all our muleteers, senior muleteers, and Medici muleteers. If you haven't yet, like and follow the Facebook. This is where we do a lot of our videos now, but we also share them out on YouTube. There's a link to the YouTube channel in that. And if you like this video, please share it. Yeah, Albert, Florida's data is pretty bad too, but their charting is a little more sophisticated. Albert's talking about Florida being disingenuous with the data. Both Georgia and Florida are on my "I'm watching you" list for COVID manipulation, but Georgia just does it so badly. It's not even done well. It's like the charts aren't even past the sniff test for what they look like. Um, so yeah, the but yeah, I mean, so that's the deeper iceberg. That's it's not the bottom of the iceberg. The bottom of the iceberg, and I may do if I don't want to like wear people out with this, but this is important to understand this iceberg. When people are talking about defund the police and all this other ones, campaign zero. Why is it? My version is see the iceberg, brace the iceberg. You got to break this iceberg, and this iceberg exists. The tip of it is the fatalities that we see and react to. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all underneath that is the disparate policing interactions. Underneath that is the municipal and civil codes that are driving that. And even underneath that, I may get into another one, there's even a bigger iceberg of disparity of overall, all sorts of things become disparate when you look deep enough. But that may get into another Ask Me Anything. But we talked in the past about, see the iceberg, break the iceberg, the efforts to convert momentum for campaign zero or defund the police into from these protests, the interest overall in the protest. Are they going to sustain? We've talked a couple times. Are they going to hit that 3.5% number? And so I wanted to share some data which sort of tries to get to this question of what is the interest level? So this is a Google Trends, and I have to give a shout out to Lissa for sending me this particular link and showing me how to use it. These are Google search terms. This is not a perfect absolute number. These are relative comparison between several terms I put in there, and it's showing how over time, how these compare relative to each other. So this is a relative scale, and it's comparing coronavirus is blue, George Floyd is red, and Trump for a baseline is at, because he's always in the news, is sort of this orange. And it only goes back to May 17th. And what I wanted to do was capture the dynamics of national attention. Where does national attention go relative to Google terms? Now, I did check a lot of other terms. People like, what about racism, police brutality, COVID-19, other terms for the president I could use, but I'm not because it's a family blog. All of those were at lower values. These seem to be the most popular search terms. So I thought it was equivalent to compare them. And what you see here is that the coronavirus has had a fairly constant, steady decline, but still at very high volumes. What happens with the George Floyd protest is for a period of time, it rises and eclipses coronavirus as a story of national concern, again, relative to Google searches. And you can see this is the period that if you looked at my, when we talked about the dictator's dilemma, the protests were going on, there was escalations of riots, the Trump cleared Lafayette Square with illegal tactics, there was a threat of the insurrection, and it began declining pretty quickly and has been on a steady decline since then, which means that there's it's not saying there's waning interest in the protests. There's still lots of protests, but in terms of an aggregate level national interest, you see that it's struggling to maintain that mind share. And that's the challenge that arises in these situations, is not, are riots good or bad, or are protests good or bad, or talking those specific things, but how do you convert the kinetic energy of an iceberg being converted to kinetic energy in one of these things? How do you convert it to sustained momentum if you want to create systemic change and create enough of a mass mobilization that keeps things on the surface to be able to support those efforts? You can see here, Trump rose as the, and it's probably kind of, there was this, he was playing to his base about, and also gaining mind share from being more provocative as he's interjecting himself. So you can see here he's interjecting himself, but he also declines. And the decline here almost perfectly coincides with Lafayette Square. You could draw June 1st with here on Lafayette Square and his invocation of the Insurrection Act, and it just drops out. But also within these questions of how to sustain momentum is this question of what's getting more airtime. Is it defund the police? Is it campaign zero? Is it these programs? So, I mean, Minneapolis 150. So to describe these programs real quick, when I do violence reduction research, there's programs out there for reducing police interaction or police disparity. The Black Lives Matter originally recommended campaign zero in 2014, 2015. There is one that was called the MSP 150, the Minneapolis 150. These are it's talking about, it's the 150 is 150 years of police disparity. That had a lot of radical proposals in it, but it was a kind of well thought out program, certainly more on the radical side, but very well developed. MSP 150 is the basis of defund the police. It goes from complicated things of breaking these icebergs, right? How do we dismantle these icebergs I've just discussed? That's what MSP 150 is. That gets shortened and becomes defund the police, which, causes some controversy. Is that a good name or a bad name? And then suddenly Seattle comes swooping in with the, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and we can see the change in interest nationally play out across these 4 terms. So what you see here is going back to June 1st. So this is during the Floyd protest. You see Campaign Zero is gaining traction, getting a little bit, then it's taken over. So these are, again, yellow Campaign Zero, green defund the police, red police reform is kind of a generic baseline that I took, and blue is Chaz. So you see Campaign Zero start to get interest and then decline as defund the police, and defund the police is getting oxygen. It again hits that decline point and begins losing momentum, and then suddenly Seattle, swooping in from the sidelines with Chaz, all of a sudden takes all the oxygen out of the room. I mean, it is just this is sort of amazing how much you call it CHOP or Chaz, autonomous or occupied protest. There's all sorts of names going around. This is this peaceful Capitol Hill protest that when the police withdrew in Seattle from the precinct after having a very, the police were a provocative force in the weekend before, and they kind of realized they'd been that. So they withdrew from Capitol Hill. The protest area went in. It went through a bunch of name changes. It's still going on. But you can see here how it takes the oxygen right out of the conversation. So instead of nationwide reform, now this isn't saying things aren't going on. I know for a fact there's been new budgets being voted in. Minneapolis voted to defund its police. Other cities are voting in to reduce its. LA did a major budget shift of dollars from the LAPD to other services. So there's still action going on. These Google search trends are only reflecting a very aggregate, crude national level interest. It's not a perfect number, but it's a representational number. Lucas is asking good questions. Can I go into more detail about targeted deterrence? So it's focused deterrence and pulling levels. At a high level, I'll probably do an entire Ask Me Anything about that, because this is one of my pet projects. When it comes to violence reduction, there's 98% of the oxygen in the room is about gun control. But when you look at people who study violence reduction, such as myself, and a lot of community groups that are driving programs, they're often not as focused on gun control as they are what is called violence reduction. And probably the most successful form of that is something called focused deterrence or pulling levers. And you will see there's actually a link in the discussion called The Coastline of American Violence. It's an 1.5-hour video where I go into excruciating depth about how we tracked homicides with something called fractal segmentation. It gets in that video to what focused deterrence is, but at a high level, it's a way of preemptively intervening in gang violence and domestic violence, which are both very, very sort of pattern-based forms of violence. You can see them coming, and it's intervening in a non-police way. It's targeting a set of circumstances that occur, and it's a very small population for the city, and then using services and intervention at that point to keep the crime from happening. People get worried that it's precognitive, precognition minority report stuff. It's really more causal sense and a long experience at this, but it provides services. For example, if there's a turf dispute between 2 gangs and there's a shooting one night that kills one gang member, they know who's going to retaliate or is likely to retaliate in the next shooting. And what they do is they intervene with services to say, you need anything with, and the services can be all across the board: employment support, food support, housing, mental health. And these are non-police services. The goal here is to use non-police. Now, in the background, the police are used as deterrence. That's the deterrence. The police say, we know your friend was just killed. We're watching you. Please don't go out and retaliate. And the purpose of doing that is if you can stop that next retaliation, you cut the link in the chain that creates the feedback loop that drives an enormous amount of death. Same concept in domestic violence, except now we're looking at if you have a restraining order, you've been charged with stalking, you have multiple violations. This isn't just anyone going through divorce. These are like the 5% of people who are truly a danger or threat to their intimate partners. They will intervene on those people and say, hey, we notice you're going down a path that in a lot of times is going to end up in murder or violence. We're here to intervene. What do you need support on? What do you need services on? Again, the police are in the background saying, we've got an eye on you. And what they found with these programs is it dramatically reduces violence. Again, this is high level. It gets into a lot more detail in this. I may do an Ask Me Anything on that itself, but if you want a little bit more information on that, it's in the coastline of violence. So let me pause here and thank everyone for being with us. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the Infomullet, www.patreon.com/Infomullet. It's $5 a month. And we appreciate it. Like, follow, share the videos. We're going to put these all up on YouTube. What we do after any Ask Me Anything is we slice and dice the videos into, there will be a full segment, that's the whole part, and then we'll put these into segments so it's easy to share on Facebook. And in case you have that hypothetical Chad who's out there just, arguing, well, what about 911 calls? You can slice my data and give them an answer from YouTube. So let me pause here and see if there is any questions so far before because the next topic's kind of split from this. So what did people want? Did we want to, what's going on? I've got votes for India and China. I haven't seen many votes for COVID-19 update. So let me check here. Bonky, what do you want? Bonky's gonna, what do people want to hear more about? I'm checking to see if there are any questions I missed here. Okay, so let's go to India, right? India and China border dispute. This one's interesting. Like, I think it's interesting too, because a lot of people are like, oh, these are big countries. And the first thing that, if you're not familiar with this, the first thing you hear is that there's two nuclear armed countries that have fought wars in the past, just had a fight where 20 people on one side, maybe up to 50 on another died. And so people are like, does this mean it's World War III? What's the Infomullet answer when anyone asks, is this World War III? No, it's not World War III. So we can calm down on that. It's not going to be World War III. What is going, the second thing that they heard about this is that these deaths were not like artillery and planes. These were deaths that were involved in fisticuffs and rock throwing. And people are like, wait, what? How is this going on? The Indian and the Chinese army go at each other. Well, so here's the background. Here's the context. India and China have been at war, or not, they haven't been at war. They've gone to war in the past over a border that runs the Himalayas. It's like 1961 or 2. And China won, right? So they had a border line that was set up, but it was somewhat in contention. It's called the targeted line of control and the actual line of control. So there's two border lines. The targeted is where it's supposed to be by treaty. The actual is where India has been. I mean, this is the middle of the Himalayas. It's like 14,000 feet up in the air. This is a really remote, rugged, isolated environment. And India has moved over the years to sort of claim some extra miles. And this has been going on for decades. So this is nothing new. But what happened recently is India is building a road, one of these high altitude freeways to link north-south road, which makes it easier to move troops and respond to China's logistics in this disputed area. And so in 2013 and 2014, again in 2017, you had these clashes in the disputed territory. Again, this is at high altitude. This is almost close to 3 miles high that these disputes are being. So you're already at a very rugged remote. And by agreement, to avoid an outbreak of another war, both countries, and this is kind of, I don't know of many borders that do this, agree, we're going to send really aggressive nationalistic troops into this area, but we're going to leave all their weapons back. So they, by agreement, they don't carry firearms. I mean, they have artillery and they have tanks, but it's back in the rear. It's way far. So these patrols, they're not armed with firearms. They're armed with sticks. They're armed with metal rods. They may put like shards of metal in a wooden stick. They have fists. And these fist fights, there was one just a couple weeks ago when I first began talking about this, that was a fist fight and stone throwing, injured like 20 Indians. The Chinese captured a bunch. And so you have these conflicts that are not involving modern firearms, but are still very intense. You have two nationalistic governments. Both of them have a belief that they, in the army especially, have racial superiority. Our military is better, and so when they get in close proximity, it's a brawl usually. And what happened a couple days ago is there was this fight several weeks ago where about 24 people were injured. There had been talks on the 13th of June to sort of de-escalate and move. And what you had was an Indian patrol was going along a very high mountain pass or trail. I shouldn't call it a pass. It's really a trail. This is by foot. And they run into People's Liberation Army, a Chinese patrol coming the other way. Now, the Indians said that they were ambushed. The Chinese said that they were responding to illegal Indian activity. Take your pick. whatever happened, this is the middle of the night. You're 14,000 feet up. You're on a mountain trail. You got a gorge on one side, and a brawl breaks out. Middle of the night. All of a sudden, troops from both sides begin rushing into this area from about traveling over 2 miles to get there. And you pretty soon have a brawl of about 600 people. Middle of the night, mountain trail, big gorge right next to you. So what happens is a lot of people during the fight either get pushed, shoved, or simply stumble and fall off this crevasse and fall to their deaths. We know that the Indians have lost 20 troops so far, have died in this way. There's claims that the Chinese may have lost up to 50 troops this way. This is a situation that, unlike past clashes, one of the reasons they don't have firearms is they're trying to avoid both these countries are so nationalistic. The fear is if they have fatalities, national pride will become on the line, and you'll get in this feedback loop. I mean, you go back to the battle in Syria between Russia and the U.S., where both sides kind of agreed not to talk about it because they didn't want their respective home populations, where the U.S. ended up killing about 300 Russians. They didn't talk about it because they didn't want their country's nationalist populations to sort of make de-escalation hard. Same thing's going on here. India originally said, well, there was only 1 or 2 killed. Now they've had to admit there were 20 killed. China's released no numbers of deaths, which is unusual because it's not like if they wanted to rah and get people stoked up, they'd release the deaths. But there's a real problem here for India in that China is so much bigger, even before the pandemic. China's economy is about 14 trillion. India's economy is about 3 trillion. China spends about 220 billion on its military, or what we like to call a quarter U.S., whereas India spends about 52 billion, an eighth U.S. So there's a huge disparity in size, and India cannot afford a fight with China at this point. India is suffering in the pandemic a lot worse than China is. China, for as much as we've sort of the civil liberties violations they did with this people's war method of containing the outbreak, they've done a much better job than India, and India is suffering a rapid outbreak. Now, India on its borders has 3 semi-hostile neighbors. You got Pakistan on one side with the Kashmir province, the disputed Kashmir province and all that. You got China now in the north. Nepal's not happy with India too. So really you have this situation where India's its borders are now being increasingly hostile and militarized while the pandemic's going on. What results of this is India is now, you'll see India, Prime Minister Modi has like the party in India, I think it's the BNP, don't quote me on that, is a very nationalistic, populist sort of government, much like Trump's administration, and Prime Minister Modi has approached Trump for help against China, Nepal, and Pakistan. So this fisticuffs that began in the middle of the night that result in these deaths may result in more strategic alignment between India and the U.S. because India is looking for allies to check its perceived fear against Pakistan, Nepal, and China. And yes, Mick has this. If you want to see the level of national pride, watch the border display between India and Pakistan. This is I just shared this actually with a Mulitaire Stefan right before the AMA. If you want to see a nonviolent version of nationalism, Google India-Pakistan border closing ceremony and watch the YouTube videos. This thing has a sense of style that would put Hollywood nightclubs to shame. What it is it's the border between Pakistan and India, and they have a ritualized, very aggressive, very ceremonial, like they find the tallest troops they have, they put headdresses on them that go 3 feet in the air, they have all these elaborate moves and shouts and very aggressive posturing, and it's all staged and choreographed. They do it every night. It's kind of a tourist event, but it does show the level of nationalism between the two countries in the dispute here. So yeah, it is an interesting. If you have time, could you cover the DPRK bombing and what that building was? I don't know off the top of my head what that bombing is, Mike. So, or if you're talking to North Korea, the Korean bombing, I don't have the details on that, Mike. I'll have to look into it. So I can't cover that. Okay, let's go back through here. Questions. So India questions here. Road gave India year-round access to the area. Thanks, Mick. Beth's pointing out that, yeah, if you're in the U.S., the highest you're going to get is like 11,000 feet. Mount Rainier had like 13,000, I think. Himalayas are 14,000 and up. So they're very high up. Oh yeah, with the North Korea, I'm not going to get into North Korea today because that's too complex to jump in as sort of an afterthought here. Um, So John's asking about, look at the borders in the region of India, Pakistan, Nepal, and China. Do you also overlay historical borders in recent centuries? So this is a good question. What John's talking about is, if you think about the British Empire, when the British Empire colonized this area, everything from Afghanistan through Bangladesh was, and maybe further, don't quote me on this, but at least Afghanistan through Bangladesh was one border. British colony. Now they would separate this, and they'd have different civil authorities. But then, as the British began withdrawing in the 1940s, you had this partition, and the partition was mainly between a Muslim population in what is, so Afghanistan splits off. You have this partition of what is mainly Muslim Pakistan now from what is mainly Hindu India. That partition, 1947, I think, caused a tremendous amount of violence. Hundreds of thousands of people killed. There was conflicts and wars. That set the tone for the conflicts that have occurred ever since. This isn't to say that there isn't a large Muslim population in India. There is. There's a Muslim population in India about the size of 3/4 of the United States. I think it's 230,000 Muslims in India. So yeah, in a nation of 1.2 billion, that's, a minority, but that's a huge population. And these ethnic conflicts between Muslim and Hindu populations have existed. But in the 1970s, Bangladesh splits off from India. It's a Muslim majority country. It was, for a while, more aligned with Pakistan. And if Sabina's on here, she'll correct me because she knows this better than I do, but I'm kind of going off memory here. So you have these historical divisions. I don't tend to put too much credence that something that happened is the sole reason. For like the China-India dispute, that emerged in 1967 as you have a rising China and a rising India meet in the Himalayas over this very strategic path. And Bangladesh, for as much as it aligned with Pakistan in the 1970s, recently the government in Bangladesh, which is also suffering from a very horrible pandemic outbreak, it's aligning itself with India for economic reasons. There's a lot of economic trade that goes on. A lot of day laborers from Bangladesh go into India. So you got to be careful. Some of these historical narratives are useful for context, but are not explanatory for all that's going on in a region. Yep. So good comments. Let's talk about, I saw a comment in here of COVID-19. I wanted to get to, where's Christy? Christy was asking. The only thing about COVID-19 that occurred about is your gut feeling on how reliable the data is. Very amateur feelings of observing the data is that we're seeing a lot of data being potentially downplayed, understated in some deliberate manner to make case numbers and death numbers lower, but I may just be a quack. Well, I cannot speak on whether or not you are a quack, Christy, but I can go to the data of COVID that we have and at least show you what I'm seeing in terms of good data versus bad data. So let me open up these charts here, share them. Okay, so first of all, for context, before I get in the charts, as everyone knows, or hopefully knows, we never ended wave 1 in the United States. The fear that we had reopened too soon. I did a video on this 2 weeks ago. Wave 1.5, it's the failure to close off one wave. Normally in epidemics, one wave is you go up, you come down, and you break. And then there's a pause, and wave 2 is a separate up, down, break. And you see a lot of countries are having that behavior. Even the ones that did badly, Italy, Spain, France, they went up, they had a really bad time, they came down, they're breaking. The US behavior is up, down a little, and then slow burn. We've been in the slow burn now since the reopenings began. And, it wasn't so much, I don't think it was the protests against the closures that were sort of in April, although I'm not quite sure because I was sick then. But those were probably not large population enough. But near the end of April and through May, when states began reopening, that was certainly enough population to begin seeding this slow burn situation where we're still having 20 to 25,000 people a day get sick. Certainly the protests, since George Floyd was murdered, the protests are only going to exacerbate that. Again, the pandemic's neutral. It doesn't have a virtue. It doesn't have a morality. It doesn't care whether you're breaking the pandemic rules because you want to go to a hair salon or you feel that employment's important in the economy or you're doing it for social justice. It's still going to do what it's going to do. So I think we're going to continue to see the cases rise. And the data I've seen, Christy was talking about data, most states are now responding. Like I saw Florida actually talk about closing its bars and restaurants a week after opening it. For Florida to talk about closing its bars means that they're taking it seriously. In Texas, Austin, was considering going back into lockdown. Houston was warning that they may have to do it. So I'm seeing states that have traditionally been reluctant at least float the trial balloons of reinstituting the lockdown. But what's making that harder is when I talked about the belief in the COVID, I talked about deaths. At this point, it's become like most things. So red versus blue, rhetoricized that only as deaths increase in your immediate 3-degree network are people going to believe that this is dangerous. And what's happened is our death rate has steadily declined since that peak in the New York supercluster. Now, we're still losing between 300 to 1,000 a day. These aren't nothing numbers, but they're significantly less. And as far as data goes, this does not look like a manipulated data chart. I'm sure this is globally, like across the US, this is probably underreported by 10 to 15%. We know the challenges with correctly classifying the data and reporting it. But even if this was 10 to 15% higher, it would still show a decline of 10 to 15%. These kind of declines here are, you see these in when you look at behavior modes and systems thinking, it's really hard to fake these kinds of behavior modes. You have to know what you're doing. Usually they fake it like Georgia, right? Georgia comes out with a chart that's like, oh, we're gonna have the days in different alignment. We're gonna have these wacky numbers. When you look at data a lot, you can tell when people are getting loose. I don't see this data as being manipulated other than perhaps being overall underreported. But if it's underreported throughout, it's probably still being underreported, and the behavior mode would be the same. Same thing when we see with hospitalizations, right? I showed this before, and it's probably a little small. Let me see if I can increase the size here. Right, this shows hospitalization by age of from the CDC provisional data. And I showed this once before, but now we have, beginning in March through June, we have increasing hospitalization rates regardless of age group. Down here is the breakup. 18 to 29 is the lowest one here. Then you've got 30 to 39 and 40 to 49. So again, 50 firearm, all age groups now have more COVID hospitalizations than firearms. That's the one threshold they've passed. Most of them are starting to pass the car accident hospitalization rate. You see here this 50 to 64, well above car accidents, hypertension. I think diabetes is at 250. One of the most prolific reasons people get hospitalized in this is diabetes. And if you're in one of these at-risk groups, 65 or older, you're there. So the hospitalizations are continuing to increase. And I think what's going on, Christy, to your point, is certain states, Florida, Georgia, definitely are probably playing loose with the numbers. But at this point, what it is that those hospitalization rates are filling the beds up again. We talked about flatten the curve, and that was discussed for so often. Now, as it moves in the rural area, and definitely now COVID-19 is nationwide in what it's doing, it's filling up those hospitals, but we're not seeing the same death rates. And until we see the same death rates or the high death rates, I don't think there's going to be, it's going to be hard to have the political will, I think, to do what's necessary. So that's my COVID take. Yeah, Lucas is talking about unknown deaths are on a quick rise, which corresponds with COVID deaths being on the decline in some areas. So Florida was caught doing this. Florida has an unknown, or I think it was pneumonia. They had a corresponding high in pneumonia. That kind of stuff I think needs to be sorted out, but it's going to be. Oh, Christy's got a clarification here. She's good clarification. It's so the news articles I'm seeing about Florida closing bars are individual businesses deciding to close, not the state government. Got it. Good clarification. I was surprised to see Florida potentially closing bars. That's a good clarification. Mike, I don't think there's been an intentional. Mike's asking about herd immunity. Sweden has definitely pursued a policy of herd immunity. I think ours is just negligence, apathy, and laziness. We had. I don't think anyone's at a high level making a conscious decision other than to not have a federal plan, because it's every state can do their own. So if they wanted to pursue herd immunity, they would be encouraging the states to, there would be a national plan for that, like there is in Sweden. I think it's really the ant versus the grasshoppers. The U.S. had an opportunity when winning the hammer to put in place contact tracing, testing, all those things you need to do. And we took the grasshopper approach of, well, we'll hire some people, maybe we'll get around to it, but we're going to go ahead and reopen anyway. We didn't put in the work, and now you're seeing it. I don't think that's an intentional. It may look like it's a conspiracy, but I think it's actually just benign neglect. And as Ed's pointing out, there's no case for herd immunity. But whether people are doing it as an intentional policy, I don't think so. I think it's just benign neglect. Yeah, Mike and Lucas have, or excuse me, Lucas and Ed have asked that the herd immunity itself is not a valid strategy. Is someone pursuing an invalid strategy by intent? I don't think so. Again, thank you for joining this. We're at the top of the hour. If you have any additional questions, throw them in real quick, but I want to be respectful of time here. Like, share, follow this video. If you haven't yet, become a Muleteer subscriber at www.infomullet.com or excuse me, www.patreon.com/infomullet. $5 for a monthly subscriber. We appreciate everyone who supports us. This stuff is not easy to put together, so appreciate it so we can spend the time. And again, we're gonna take this video, we're gonna splice it up into the different segments, we're gonna throw it up on YouTube, and that way you can use and share it. So I'm gonna see if COVID-19 right now. Mick is talking about COVID-19 surpassing cars and heart disease. I'm pretty sure we're on the path of, I mean, if you think about what causes the top 10 cause of deaths for mortality, I mean, as someone who studies violence and instability, you get familiar with the top 10 causes of death. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's like 450 for heart disease, 350 for cancer. Those are the top 2 causes of death every year, year after year. And then it goes down from there. COVID right now is at 120 something or other, 120-ish. And it's slowing down a lot. The death rate is slowing down. Again, you might pop it up for 10 to 15%. It looks like it's definitely going to be in top 5. And that's with all the lockdowns. That's what people forget. We're top 5 causes of death in part of the year, very short part of the year, and with all these lockdowns and measures against it. So I think it's a pretty serious issue. All right, everyone's taken off. That's a good sign for me. From myself and Bonky, please, if you can, stay inside. If you can't, stay safe. Thank you very much for all your support. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.